Homi, can I invite you to join us now from Brookings? Homi is, I'm sure, well known to almost everybody here. He's Senior Fellow and Deputy Director in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. Among other things, he's now playing a central role in supporting the high-level panel on post-2015. He's had over 25 years at the World Bank, including being Chief Economist for East Asia and in charge of PREM, so that's a pretty good track record. Homi, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
And can you see the slides?
Yeah.
At least the title slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to leap in. I don't have pretty pictures like Andrew. I've got a very boring presentation, but I want to make just a few points in the 10 minutes. First, I want to argue that philanthropic assistance is actually very large and growing very fast. And so in some sense, that's the good news. So a lot of the discussion about ODA and the fact that ODA is now flat, I think misses the point to some extent. Second, I want to argue that philanthropic assistance is actually quite different from ODA and that it operates much more on the demand side rather than on the supply side. That said, philanthropic assistance increasingly, or private giving more broadly, is actually also quite differentiated. And so I'm going to talk about several different types of private giving. And in particular, I think that private giving has been much quicker than official aid in recognizing the importance of trying to get to scale and doing things in a way that can potentially get to scale. And that's actually quite good news for the leverage that Andrew was talking about. The leverage will come not just from leveraging more money, the leverage will come from leveraging greater impact. And last, I will give a few words about what actually drives some of the philanthropic giving. So first, just to show you the extent and size. I mean, we are used to thinking of aid as being the, really the very large chunk of the pie. The reality is that when you strip out from aid administrative costs and humanitarian assistance and all of the various things that don't actually go directly to countries to be programmed into their projects and programs, you get much smaller numbers. And I see that Judith is there on the panel, so if there are questions, she will explain better than me what country programmable aid really means. So CPA is this concept of country programmable aid. It's a very useful concept that the DAC has introduced that essentially says that not everything that is counted as ODA actually ends up in a developing country. Now, we do have some difficulty in having that same concept of CPA extended to private giving and to South-South cooperation. But roughly speaking, here are some numbers. So I just want to make the point that we're no longer talking, when we talk about private giving, about a small, possibly interesting niche financing. We're actually talking about a very, very large chunk of the pie. Now, it looks bigger than some of the others, but that's precisely because I've lumped together these many different categories of private financing, and increasingly I think that it's a mistake to think of them all in the same bucket. Now, in terms of trends and growth rates, actually you can see that private financing, despite the recession, has been growing reasonably fast. These numbers come from the Hudson Institute. They cover 14 OECD countries. My guess is that they are underestimated by probably something like maybe a third or more because of the lack of country coverage. That would tend to boost that number a little bit. Looking at the growth rates is quite difficult simply because we don't really have the tradition of measuring private aid with the same degree of rigor that we can measure official aid. So I would certainly say that the growth rate time trend numbers should be taken as indicative rather than definitive. What we do have better numbers for is total philanthropic giving, both domestic and international, and that has probably been growing at the rate of something like 20% per year, with very little signs of it slowing down. And as some of the large foundations start to disburse more money, it may even accelerate. So what do we think about the difference between these? Well, private aid and philanthropy basically goes into what I would call public, the provision of basic services. It's education and health and water and things like that. And they tend to have much lower levels of overhead costs. The big drawback is that when funneled through some NGOs, it's fragmented. And I think one of the big differences is that now that you have some large foundations coming on board and some private businesses, and Chris will speak to this, there is far more emphasis on those interventions actually going to scale. And Chris and I have just been collaborating on a volume talking about this notion of scale. The thing about ODA is that a lot of it doesn't actually ever reach developing countries. So, you know, it's become its value as a measure is really becoming, I think, a bit lower. And today CPA is only around 55 cents per dollar. And that's what goes to the governments of these countries. So what actually reaches the beneficiaries is likely to be substantially lower. Now, the big advantage that ODA does have is that the givers of ODA have a great dialogue with national governments. And I think what's increasingly being recognized is that the private aid also cannot really be really effective, especially when it wants to get to scale, if it disregards this idea of the dialogue with the government. And then finally, I think we've got South-South cooperation, doesn't really want to talk about aid at all, but wants to talk about development solutions. And so it's bundled with all kinds of other things of, you know, trade, investment, technical cooperation, and in many ways is closer to what Andrew was just saying in terms of the leverage of finance. There's no particular need for many of the South-South partners to differentiate between what is aid and what is commercial financing. And let me just say that in today's environment, where the difference between IBRD loans and IDA credits is no more than 17 basis points, that strict differentiation that counts one as aid 100% and the other as aid 0% seems to be more and more arcane. So quickly, some trends. Well, some of the internet-based platforms that private giving has used have actually scaled up very, very rapidly. And organizations like Kiva.org, which is a microcredit organization, is now doing, here the number says 2 million every week. Actually, the most recent numbers are over 3 million every week. So $150 million per year from one rather small organization based in San Francisco, just because they've got a scalable internet platform. And there are several others that are doing the same thing. The big breakthrough, I think, is that much of this private giving is now taking advantage of new IT technologies, and in particular, the increased mobile phone coverage. And we all know that today, probably something like 2 billion poor people do not have access to any kind of internet connection. In 10 years' time or 15 years' time, there will probably be near universal mobile phone coverage, including amongst the poorest people. And we see this in the very rapid uptake now of mobile phone telephony, of mobile phones in Africa, but also in other countries. That permits these new kinds of scalable technologies to really take off. And what they do is they permit the money to actually reach the beneficiary without going through transactions costs. So you can potentially save maybe something like 50 cents on the dollar right there. You're giving money to poor people rather than giving them services, and so it's what I'm calling demand-driven development. I think that that will radically change the nature of how services are provided and who provides those services. You can actually target both poor people and even within families. You can target to mothers if you like. You can target to young people. You can differentiate much more in a much more granular way using this. Everything is recorded because it's all an electronic transaction, so it gives rise to possible uses from big data. I've talked about the overhead costs, and frankly, I think that one of the things we know, even from official giving of cash transfers, is that cash transfers have tended to actually have a very significant impact on poverty. The worries that we had that some of it would be frittered away, I think, have been really diminished by the magnitude of the impact evaluations that have been done on such schemes. So the purpose, this is just something, and actually now that I see Chris there, he will talk much more about this. The idea basically in many, particularly foundations, is that people are going to try to change industries and change sectors rather than just do a single intervention or a single project. That, I think, is one of the most exciting things in development which is happening, because if we can actually move towards making markets, making new sectors, helping them develop, that is likely to prove to be a far more sustainable way of poverty reduction, and ultimately much cheaper than trying to do it through individual projects. So this is going to require programmatic approaches and partnerships. There's also a sense that private giving enjoys a much greater support in terms of public opinion. These numbers are basically for the US, but I think that similar numbers probably hold in other places. So a lot of people still actually in the United States, with the budgetary pressures, actually talk about cutting foreign aid. The difficulty, of course, is that most of these people are enormously misinformed about how much foreign aid is actually given. So the perceptions, the average perception in the United States, people think that about 25% of the federal budget goes to foreign aid, and they say, well, let's cut that to about 10%. So you can read this as you will, because the good news and the bad news is the actual number is somewhere around 1%. So you can either say that there is public support for having 10 times more foreign assistance, or you can say that there is public support for halving foreign assistance. By contrast, there's very strong and very substantial and consistent support for philanthropy, and one of the interesting things is that's held up very well through the current recession. If anything, it has actually increased as times have gotten harder. One major problem is that very little private giving, and here I'm talking about not just philanthropic assistance, but also some of the new corporate giving, very little of it is actually managed in any systematic way. The data that we have is really poor, it's very spotty. Very few countries have an ability to have any understanding of what is going on in their countries. It can't be linked in an easy fashion to national development strategies. And all of that is a significant problem, which is starting to get possibly a little bit easier as we move towards better aid management platforms at the country level. And, you know, here we've all talked about the transparency of aid. It's all very useful, but that is typically now really focused just on ODA. The big gains in transparency are going to come when we can integrate those flows with private flows in national databases, and then ultimately also, of course, with budget revenues themselves. Last, I want to just talk about how private giving is actually quite different from traditional ODA. So ODA is very much linked to support for countries, and private aid is definitely oriented to supporting people. And when we look empirically at which countries actually receive the money, we see quite significant differences. For ODA, you see major shifts in aid towards Iraq and Afghanistan and other areas where foreign policy has a dominant motive. In private aid, you tend to get quite a different set of empirical correlates. We've just done some work on the Hoodoo Kiva donors. We use Kiva as our database because it's all electronic, so we know something about it. And what we've done is we've matched the Kiva donations with some databases in the United States on immigrants. And basically what we find is that the countries that get the most Kiva donations are actually countries with large shares of immigrants in the United States. So it's people giving back to their home countries. We see that when the immigrants have come more recently than the year 2000, they tend to give more. So you see a very definite trend for this to start to taper off the longer the immigrant community becomes established. You see very clear links between the incomes of the immigrants in their new host country, like the United States, as compared to what they would earn in their own country. So it's all very much of a person-to-person type of relationship. And all of the things that are so important for official aid, like governance and country per capita incomes and the quality of institutions and things like that, all of those basically disappear as determinants of private giving. So I would argue that this new phenomenon is a phenomenon of global connectedness. It is the Facebook phenomenon. It's the phenomenon that people now do have connections with people in lots of other countries. And that is something that is really going to drive these flows and drive the ability to aggregate very small amounts of money into very big amounts of money. So I would just like to close with telling you that on average, a Kiva donation is something like $100. And so that is being aggregated into these very large flows, which, as I said, are now averaging something like $150 million per year and still growing very rapidly. So these are fantastic aggregators, and it's this aggregation that will allow us to go to scale in financing. Thank you.